So I think this is a good time to talk about debt trap diplomacy as well. So if you want to.
Exactly, and this is one of the things that it's one of the perhaps most discussed memes, as we call it, the debt trap diplomacy meme. And I mean,
how do you view that meme? Do you think there's something to it? Do you think it's? I know it's a controversial thing to discuss, but how would you approach it?
I mean, from the way I see it, there have certainly been some let's say less beneficial investments being made, and this is essentially what my project is about, is unpacking all of these intricacies of the different investments and finding out exactly what went wrong, where, and with whom the fault, if that is the way to put it, is to be put. But I do think that now in recent years, we've seen very, very good work from Sri Lankan scholars, for example, like Umesh Murumudali and Helena Panduwala, taking these things and unpacking them and actually saying what has actually been taking place. Deborah Brodikim from the Johns Hopkins University in the US has also been quite frequently writing about the so-called debt trap diplomacy. And I think at this moment you can say that the myth of Chinese debt trap diplomacy as like a very specific strategy has been dispelled. That's not to say that there aren't white elephant projects. That's not to say that some of these projects are definitely not meeting the targets and are definitely not beneficial for the people. And this is essentially where I position myself. I try to figure out why did this actually come to this point and what is actually taking place now. What are the remedies that can be sort of done for this? And I mean, I can return and talk about where the Belt and Road is at right now, but I think generally speaking, I can at least say that my impression of Sri Lanka is that there have been certain issues from both sides of the bilateral relationship when it comes to China and Sri Lanka, when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative investments, especially in the ports of Hambantota and Colombo. And I think this is one of the things that going forward, it's going to be, it will continue to be a make or break it point for China's influence in Sri Lanka, whether these ports actually become more financially viable than they currently are, and in which form this would sort of take shape. Generally speaking, I can say that I think there have been missteps and a certain amount of mismanagement from both China's side, but also from the Sri Lankan side when it comes to the elite stakeholders that were involved in the project. Now, I know this is also a bit controversial, but the Rajapaksa family has had quite a big role in these projects, and I don't believe that the projects have always been utilized or put in place in a way that was truly conducive to what they could actually be if, say, the infrastructure investments had been made in a different manner, if the projects had been linked up in a different manner. So that's just to say, I'm not here to assign blame. I'm just here to say there have been issues, and the same goes for other countries where the Belt and Road has been installed in different projects, such as Djibouti, for example, where we see the same thing happening with some elite stakeholders that have certain interests in implementing the project in a certain way, that have certain interests in skimming off the profits in a certain way to suit their own, let's say, voting base or constituency, whatever it is. And this essentially means that the projects fall short or they fall flat compared to what they could be. And at the same time, I think China, for its part, and I say China, but I mean really the Chinese central government, the CCP, but also the Chinese state-owned enterprises, for their role in the matter, have fallen short in several respects. I think in some ways, China has been negligent, I would say, when it comes to the implementation and the governance of the projects, because China has not, in certain ways, done its homework when it comes to Sri Lanka's own political and economic situation. So I think, and this is something that I see in a lot of different places, it's not just here that's taking place, but it's a big problem when we talk about the Belt and Road Initiative, that all of the emphasis is put on China. Of course, quite a lot of the, let's say, China's still at this sort of steering the project. So China's still at the end of the negotiation table when it comes to these things. But I still think we have to unpack the reality of Chinese investments and to really truly see that Chinese foreign policy, including the Belt and Road Initiative, is a lot more responsive, decentralized, flexible, and a lot more pragmatic than we actually seem to think. So China, rather than being viewed as this very monolithic power that just suppressed Sri Lankan interests and all of these things, is actually a lot more responsive to bottom-up bargaining and negotiations and all of these things. However, I also see that Sri Lanka has, shown considerable agency when it comes to certain parts of the initiative, but there are also certain things in which the government has not perhaps done all it could. And of course, this is also a very opaque process, and this is part of the issue. We don't have that much documentation when it comes to how these different things have been, let's say, the selection process, the feasibility studies, all of these things, that we are actually lacking certain dimensions, which also means that it's hard to adequately assess what has actually been taking place and who actually called the shots on which parts of the process and so on and so forth. But the very sort of brief overarching takeaway from this is that it takes two to tango. Yes. And with the Belt and Road Initiative, for sure, I think we need to pay more attention to host country agency issues, to host country agency in general when it comes to actually bargaining for better Belt and Road deals. And this has been taking place now. You said certain projects have been called back or reshaped, or these kinds of things have been taking place. And this is true in different countries. We see that different countries have now started to say, well, we don't really believe that China has our best interests at heart, or we don't believe that these rates are the best. We don't believe these loans are the best. So can we restructure? Can we do something different? And a lot of these countries have done this over political fears, but a lot of countries have also done this over more economic, motivations. So seeing Sri Lanka for many countries has actually been a watershed moment, I think. Like seeing Sri Lanka with the 99-year lease of Hambantota port to China merchants, but also now all of the debates about sovereignty that have taken place in Port City, whether they're true or not. I'm not here to really get into that. I'm just here to say a lot of other countries are taking cues from these things and saying, hold up, we need to make sure that China actually is accountable when it comes to these things. And conversely, I also think that a lot of other developing countries that have very weak governance regimes also need to make sure that they take accountability when it comes to these things.
So I think you mentioned what I believe is probably what's going on, is that there's a certain amount of elite capture going on between the Chinese investments and the local political power centers, right? So when you mentioned the Rajapaksa family, so it's a very clear sort of arc. Post-war, 2009, the war ended. The rest of the world was sort of going through a financial crisis. China became the global engine of growth with, all they bought up record numbers of US Treasury bills, for instance, and then the Belt and Road Initiative a few years later. So we've seen this clear arc, and the Rajapaksa family happened to be in power at this time. And it's not surprising then that most of the large investments came up in Hambantota, which is their main city, town. Now, looking at that model that's happened in Sri Lanka, and you mentioned Umesh Muramudli, for instance, and their conversations around the myth of, I say myth in inverted commas, the myth of Chinese imperialism, shall we say, and then the debt trap diplomacy conversation. If we just briefly take the Hambantota port, for instance, I read that piece by Tilina and Umesh, and it was very interesting. There's been a few responses to their study as well, saying that they've sort of ignored a few aspects of it. Now, with that, let's just briefly take the port, the Hambantota port, the Margampura port project. Anyone can see that Sri Lanka needed a port that has a good industrial connection to it, okay? Because the Colombo port, it's not the most accessible, it's right at the top of Fort. There's a lot of traffic in Colombo most of the time. So it makes perfect sense to have a large port which is designed for purpose, built for purpose. But somehow that port was never able to take off. Right. It was never able to reach the capacity. I don't think it still reached the capacity that it should. At the same time, we had the debts to pay. And then in 2015-16, the new government, the Yahapalne government under the current president, he was prime minister at the time, they signed the agreement, the 1990 lease agreement, right? So that was at the time reported as a debt to equity swap. But now we notice, and that's some of the work that Umesh and them did as well, is that there wasn't actually a debt to equity swap. It was just literally resettled some debts and put the rest of the money into our reserves,
Right.
and China took ownership of the port.
Right.
And we still have the loans, the majority of the loans taken for the port. So it seems to me it chimes with what you're saying. What you're saying is that, look, Chinese are there, they have the money, they want to invest, but it's really up to the local government to exercise their agency, right? It's not about just saying, oh, give us the money and we'll do what we want with it, but it's about using this proposition that China is giving to you,
Right.
and maximizing its gains for the people. So in that sense, it seems that it's not China that's necessarily failed Sri Lanka. It's the Sri Lankan government that's sort of been unable to make the most of Chinese investments. Would you agree with that?
I mean, it's a very complex issue. I still think China has fallen short in a number of respects. I don't think that China truly recognized what was going on at the time they were starting to. And I mean, it's obviously it's a difficult situation, because when you come in and you say, I have money to invest, have you done feasibility studies? Have you actually made sure that this is the place you want the port? Is it going to benefit the locals? Is it going to, I mean, I don't know what exactly the questions were that were being asked during this process. It's all very opaque, as I said. But if China had gone in and said, okay, so have you done all of this? Have you actually made sure? And the government says, yeah, sure, of course, we have.
Have you seen, now you're studying Sri Lanka, have you
Right.
have you been able to get information about the feasibility studies for example, Hambantota Port, or for any project? Have you been able to see feasibility studies, recommendations, approvals? How do you view how the process?
Very, very generally, I can say that there have been feasibility studies made during different parts of the process, and some of them, I believe, are still not known to the public, which is also what happens due to, I mean, a lot of different things in this, of course, the Sri Lankan bureaucratic system, the fact that things are not digitalized. So there's been a lot of things. More importantly, I also think that during the construction of these ports, during the investment phase, there was a lot going on in terms of just making sure that things actually took off, that something actually happened, that there would actually be, let's say, a process started to build up the industry to do all of these things. So in that respect, I think a lot of this documentation came later. I mean, it became secondary really to what was, you know, let's just make sure we actually get something off the ground.
Right.
Because now we have the money, we need to make sure. So, I mean, one of the things I identify as also problematic is that, you know, China has, of course, invested in the port much longer than the Belt and Road has been around. So this has been like a very slow process with different installments. I mean, China took an interest very early on, I mean, 2006, 2007. So this has been a slow process, but there has been a certain tendency, let me put it like that, in the Sri Lankan government to see things in a quite short-term view. So always in 4-year increments, let's make sure we just win the power, we keep the power, and then we try to win the next election. And when the governments change like this, it becomes very, very difficult to actually follow up on these development projects, to follow up on these infrastructure projects. So that's one of the things I identify as quite problematic, is the changes in government, the changes in government policy, and the fact that these are not national development projects. These are not, let's say, instated by, like, how do I put it, a more independent government, or like even a more independent...
They're more towards the whims and fancies of individuals.
Right, and so I think that's a big problem. I think, again, it's not necessarily, it's not just Sri Lanka's fault. China has also been utilizing this to some extent, I think, and China has, I mean, if China wanted to stop the project because China was afraid of economic mismanagement or something like this, they could have also perhaps been more vocal about this. Ultimately, I think, on the Chinese side of things, one of the problems has been that part of the process, China has not perhaps been as, let's say, one thing is that they've been more negligent about certain aspects, but another thing is that they could have done more to bring in the Sri Lankan side as well. They could have consulted more. They could have brought in, let's say, top Sri Lankan, not just officials, but also people that are technically trained in these matters in the ports and that know the areas quite well.
Okay.
I think this could have been done to a much larger extent.